Hi, this is Sheena. I'm teaching about internal self attachment for self trust. In my mind, this is an essential trauma recovery skill, and it's not often talked about. And only when it is taught, it's taught from a cognitive framework, which we need the cognitive framework perhaps to get started. But for it to be thorough and complete and long lasting and to help actually start to resolve trauma, we do have to bring the body into our practicing and processing. So the cognitive channel allows 10% access into the autonomic nervous system, which controls brain body. But the bottom up processing, the body operates 90% of linking the brain and body up. So that's what gets disconnected oftentimes in trauma is the brain and body, and so I aim to sync those back up. And oftentimes, what joins in the process is the spirit and the energy, and that's often what rejoins in the process. I say rejoins because that's what gets disconnected. Dissociation, you know, in reassociation involves all parts into the whole, and all trauma responses can kind of be looked at very simply as levels of dissociation: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Dissociation, clap are all levels of types of dissociation, truly. And and so when we're talking about the mindset, and that's often where it's just left off with trauma healing. That's a first step, and that's not enough for realistic trauma recovery. We've got to bring in at some point the body, and hopefully the understanding of parts, because understanding of parts helps depathologize the all of the trauma symptoms that are mental and physical, and really gives a path forward. And so that's why I practice preventative method, meaning we're practicing this before we need to use it. It can be a game changer. We talk about ruptures and repair in the outside world, and yes, that does need to happen often for trust to be developed. But a lot of times with trauma and complex trauma, that process cannot be done, and nor can our recovery or trauma recovery be dependent on other people outward, especially other people outward that are not doing their work, and don't have enough skills. And so we've got to bring it inward. And so the process of bringing inward is starting to have the practice, hopefully on a daily basis, of checking in with yourself through your body. And I teach how to do this through the body, to become embodied in your somatic self, your healing vortex, your true self, your authentic self, a little bit more of that feeling, self energy, feeling a little bit more of what that is. Usually the portal is through, exploring through different ways of the body of feeling. And I teach this typically one on one because everyone's body is different. And then and so are their parts. Trauma is such a creative internal diversification of trauma responses. And what happens a lot of times is, well, there's a misinformation of what people think trauma actually is, and people think people remember everything about trauma, and it's a story, and it's only physical. It is that, and it's so much more. Trauma memories are actually stored through the cellular memory, through implicit body-based procedural memories, through your emotions, through trauma responses, through mental and health symptoms, and it shows up in your relationships. It shows up at work. Shows there's no context in life that doesn't show up. And so what I'm often doing at the first part of working with people is building up their capacity for self energy, and their somatic capacity, and then bringing in parts work. Depending, we may start with parts work if somatic capacity is on the lower side of things. It both ways work. That's the importance of having multiple modalities, is to be able to use them appropriately. And so building up somatic capacity, or even starting with parts work, same thing, right? Like either or, because I teach parts work through a somatic capacity. So for me, it's one and the same, just different ways of going about bringing everything into coherence, um, more and more to degrees. And it's building that capacity so that no matter what is happening in the outer world with relationships, that you're coming back to yourself and making sure that things truly are okay. Because a lot of times what happens is with trauma and complex trauma is something happens between a relationship or in a conversation or at work, and you feel like you're fine, and then later on you realize you're not fine. And sometimes people aren't able to put together what's the correlation of this. Especially, so many people don't understand interpersonal trauma and emotional trauma and how that's playing into their symptoms today. And so part of it is making that more and more clear. And I do a lot of, mapping around this. And polyvagal mapping is just profoundly useful for this. To bring that into greater awareness, because then we can start to look at these patterns. But if we don't look at the one of the most missed resources of our own self, we may continue to go back to relationships to try to get repaired or ruptures uh, in relationships that we can't. And even if the repair is there, there still may be parts of us that are not okay inside. And so that may be communicated through your thoughts. Thoughts are attached to parts through symptoms, through mental or health symptoms, or there can be this rubber band effect where there's high levels of dissociation, and then a couple days or weeks later that something things spike up, or things drop out because of the levels of dissociation, or both and at the same time, because some nervous systems have both types of trauma responses, and then extreme protector parts, and so addictions may increase, overworking may increase, and things that bring in a lot of shame to someone's systems, food, substances, behaviors. Those are parts and traumas communicating. And a lot of the communication is nonverbal. So if we only use parts work, we're missing a lot of the trauma physiology, especially with developmental childhood complex trauma that's been chronic in duration, because trauma memories are not stored through a narrative. Some are, but there's gaps even in the ones that are stored as a narrative. Like, yes, I remember that happening, and then I don't remember this from this time to this time, right? So no matter what's happening outwardly, what we can do, and we do have to focus on what we can do, because we got to focus on the controllables, is coming back inside to ourselves and attending to the level of influence that that's having on our system. And I cannot even speak to how much of a life hack game changer this is for someone with a trauma history, to come back to inside, because you can listen to younger parts that remember, they want to hear the stories if there's story that comes along with, but there may be sensation. There may just be emotional flooding. There may be someone stuck in a shame spirals. The doomies, I call the doom, just impending doom, things that look like panic attacks, anxiety, your chronic pains turning up, your symptomology, you're in an autoimmune flare. These are ways that the body is communicating. Digestive stuff, oh my gosh, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, all of that has a digestive component. Food symptoms, overworking, underworking, levels of exhaustion, levels of self-care, the degrees of thoughts, what's happening. All of this what we can do is we can commit to our self-validation, coming back to ourselves when there's been something that's happened, and come back and just check in on ourselves, and then asking the parts to come in close or turn it down a little bit once we've heard them, and then just reaffirm to them, that we're going to be able to attend to their needs, like this is self-leadership inside. But then also, if it's somatic based, we have to have somatic tools. So many folks get stuck, especially with complex trauma. We have what is known as somatic flashbacks. So a lot of times flashbacks are only talked about as visual, and they can be visual. And for those of us with complex trauma, it's emotional flooding. And this gets diagnosed, of course, of all different things. However, what's happening inside is a somatic implicit memory, which gets stacked upon one another. I mean, that's why shame is so complex trauma. Another definition of complex trauma is complex shame, because every instance of shame starts to get stacked. If you imagine it like Play-Doh, and it's like you just add another, glob of Play-Doh, and the shame, you know, compaction, and it gets bigger and bigger every time. And so once that ball of shame is touched on, wow, you can become really flooded. And so our system is so creative with trauma and diversifies so much that it can create these more extreme parts that can get involved in food and substance and behaviors and things like that to kind of pull you out of the shame spiral. Now again, these parts are more extreme and they're more antisocial. We have pro-social parts that do the people pleasing and the fawning and the doing, and those are more socially acceptable than some of those. But both compassion to both, because these parts are trying to protect you. And what's happening is important communication. So I do not look at trauma from a behavioral standpoint as far as like that's all that's happening, because behavioral is communication. I just get really curious about the behavior, because we don't want to pathologize behavior when it's trauma related. To me, that's just it's not even good science at this point if you're deeply trained in trauma. So we want to get curious about what's going on, and again, we can map this out, we can feel this out, we can hear it out. There's so many ways that we can do that, and we can come back to ourselves over and over again. The best case scenario is that it's preventative, meaning you're doing these practices before you need the practices, meaning you're checking in on yourself when things are okay. And then therefore you can attend to yourself when things are not okay. And what this does is this lessens the degrees of disruptions in your life, or just whether it be outward or inward, because it dials down the level of how much the trauma responses are expressed, like how big. It also dials down the length and then the duration, the intensity, and it gives more levels of mastery over time. And what builds time after time, every single round of coming back to yourself and validating yourself and doing internal self attachment, is higher degrees of self trust. And that is such a remedy for trauma, to have such self trust, meaning that you're not going to continue to go out and try to get folks that are really set on misunderstanding you and not providing what you need or want for your recovery, instead of your system trying to make these attempts to attach to those individuals. You can for sure come back and attach to yourself over and over again. And this gets missed so much on trauma recovery, because a lot of this gets bypassed with just the cognitive types of healing, and then these younger parts, you at 3, you at 5, you at 7, you're at 20, you're even at 30, because trauma doesn't just stop with complex trauma, because there's more. Complex trauma, developmental trauma, childhood trauma increases the likelihood of trauma in adulthood, because you get so used to chaos and dysfunction that keeps replaying out unconsciously in your life. And so it doesn't mean that it stops. And trauma can happen at any time. So a lot of times we focus on inner child work, but what if the trauma happened when you were 35, 40 years old? Then you need to talk to that 35, 40-year-old that remembers inside. What I mean by talk to, sometimes it's not verbal. Sometimes it's just a hand where you feel that, and it's just an inward acknowledgement of like, it's like a hand reaching inward to yourself of like, I got you, boo. I'm here. I'm not going to leave you. And just trusting that your body is so wise. Your body is so wise, it makes my job easy. And I know that sounds kind of strange to say that, because I'm listening and your body is communicating. The body doesn't lie. The body is communicating information, and I'm trained to listen. And so I'm just getting curious, and listening with you. And we're both listening together, and that's a wonderful thing when we're working together. But my goal is to teach you how to listen to yourself, and how to validate yourself, and how to internally attach to yourself, and therefore build self-trust. And this is, it's such a big game changer, and it's so missed. It's so missed. in trauma recovery. And you can spend years and years trying to get attachment. And we want to still try to attach with other people. Please don't misunderstand that. We want to try to. But what happens when there's attachment there, but like trauma survivors, there can be a lot of safety in the relationship, but still you don't feel safe, or still there's a lack of trust because of what's happened previously that your nervous system remembers. And this is a way to bridge that gap over and over again. Instead of trying to have the other person fulfill that for you over and over again, you can fulfill that yourself and you can bridge that gap. And that can help strengthen the relationships that you already have. It can help give information as to what relationships may need some support. And it also can help limit the re-traumatization as outer relationships. And it can make things a little bit smoother too, because you can, no matter what another person, a system, or something, somebody out there does, you can promise and guarantee yourself that you're not going to abandon yourself. And that's huge. That is so huge, because there's often the trauma of being alone in it. I mean, that's the other part of trauma, is being all alone of that. And there's a lot of different surrogates that we can use for these practices if it's really hard to do this on your own. I love teaching earth-based self-surrogate energy. I love teaching that. And there's a lot of other surrogates that we can use to help to make contact with, so that we can get into more regulation, so that we can continue to develop our secure attachment inside. And that is possible for anyone. It's just with the tools, the support, the education, the practice, and making these practices tailored to you, and what you're going through, what you're experiencing. And that is really the key and the important piece of one-on-one work. So hopefully this has helped you understand a little bit more about maybe this concept. It's not really talked about very much, so I wanted to pop up on here today and share a little bit more. And hopefully this has helped you understand a little bit more, or perhaps get a little bit more curious about potentially some other things that you can explore for yourself. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.